The Balkans, a region known for its delicious and traditional cuisine, beautiful nature and landscapes, the friendly and kind locals. But most importantly of all, especially on the internet, the Balkans are most well known for their nationalism. I don't think I really need to explain that much about why the Balkans stand out that much in terms of nationalist fervor. Balkan nationalism is an extremely fascinating field to explore and witness. Every time two Balkaners start arguing on a social media website, mostly YouTube or Twitter, people start gathering like it's a giant tourist attraction. And you bet your ass they will hurl some of the hardest insults known to mankind at each other, the wildest claims anyone ever heard of, or both at the same time. Now, if this kind of sentiment was exclusive to a few internet keyboard warriors living in their mother's basements, then no harm done. But no, the internet is merely a new form of channeling this kind of sentiment and resentment. In the good old days, it was expressed and channeled through the old-fashioned way: genocide, pillaging, and more genocide. For the past 200 years, nationalism within the Balkans has caused immense suffering to the local populations, with the Balkaners causing some of the worst atrocities Europe had ever seen. Not just to the Turks, but also to each other. One village would see the other village 10 miles away as absolute subhumans who didn't deserve life, with the atrocities reaching the point of making Hadrian's conquest of Judea look like it followed the Geneva Convention. Safe to say, if white people had their own third world, it would be the Balkans, and I am saying this as a native who grew up in this area. This has caused the Balkans to look, in the eyes of an average Westerner and to some Easterners, as a barbaric backwater where the locals only understood the language of force. Honestly, if you ask me, the fact that this kind of rage and resentment is being expressed through the internet is a major positive development. So while we all like to laugh at the average Balkan nationalist conversation on WowMau's channel, few have asked the question, why? Why is Balkan nationalism the way it is? How did it turn up like that? And how did the development of nationalism in the West differ from the development of nationalism in the South? Now, I myself, being an ethnic Bosniak, am a veteran of some of the keyboard wars waged when I was between 13 and 16 years old, until I eventually grew out of that phase and embraced more Western-style ideas, philosophy and politics. And recently, when I was thinking of that past of mine and how much of a retard I looked, I asked myself that question. How did we get here? Why are the Balkans the way they are? And that is exactly what I will be exploring in today's video. I will be going into the origins of Balkan nationalism, trying to answer that specific question. What made the Balkans, well, the Balkans? So, if the 50% of you who made it past the 30 seconds mark are still here, then buckle up. Time to bring out the books and history. You cannot discuss the evolution and development of Balkan nationalism without addressing the Ottoman period, which played a decisive role in shaping it. By the late 15th century, the majority of the Balkans had been absorbed into the Ottoman Empire, where they would remain for nearly 4 centuries. Those 400 years left a profound imprint on the society and outlook of the peoples who lived under Ottoman rule. When Ottoman armies marched into newly conquered territories, one of their first objectives was to dismantle the power of local elites. Land and authority were stripped away, nobles were sent into exile, and in many cases executed outright. Their positions were then filled by pashas and viziers, whose loyalty lay firmly with the empire. This policy stemmed from a deep mistrust of entrusting power to locals, who were viewed as potential rebels. For the Ottomans, it was far safer to install their own men and ensure that every province remained firmly tied to Constantinople. This system extended beyond provincial leadership. The entire spectrum of upper and even middle-class roles, bureaucracy, trade, intellectual life, was dominated by Ottoman loyalists and Turks. For a local to rise into such ranks, they had to renounce their culture and identity, essentially becoming servants of the empire rather than representatives representatives of their own people. Advancement meant working for the Sultan in Constantinople, not for one's community. The result was a rigid social stratification that stunted the rise of a local middle class or intelligentsia, leaving the Balkan peoples in overwhelmingly agrarian, peasant-based societies. Cities became the domains of Turks and Muslim imperial subjects, while the countryside remained largely the preserve of the locals. Yet this structure did leave one unintended benefit. Because Ottoman bureaucracy was concentrated in urban centers, rural areas were often left to govern themselves in matters of culture, religion, and local administration. The empire generally adopted a hands-off approach. As Greek historian L.S. Stavrianos notes in his work on the Balkans, quote, "The Turks had little influence on Balkan culture. One reason was that they were separated from their subjects by religious and social barriers. Another was that the Turks resided mostly in the towns. Accordingly, their cultural influence was limited largely to urban institutions. In fact, Balkan towns took on a marked Oriental character with their bazaars and mosques and narrow street lined by flimsy wooden houses. The superficiality of Turkish influence allowed the Balkan peoples to develop their respective cultures freely. In each case, they made their most important contributions in their folk literature. This was usually anonymous, composed in the vernacular and passed on from generation to generation by word of mouth. This system of rural life was shaped above all by the Ottoman introduction of the Tamar system. Compared to the rigid feudal structures of Western Europe, the Tamar was more lenient and communal, offering certain advantages to peasants. Fiefs were granted to deserving cavalrymen, known as pahis, yet these grants were typically small in scale and, crucially, non-hereditary. For peasants, land tenure was hereditary, taxation was lighter, and many of the burdens of Western feudal obligations were absent. For those reasons, Stavrianos goes as far as to note that the conditions of the peasants were largely better compared to those in Europe. Quote, "The average Balkan peasant during the early Ottoman period tilled his land under better conditions than his counterpart in Christian Europe. One advantage was the lighter tax burden. He had hereditary use of a definite tract of land, which he regarded as his own and for which he paid only the head tax, the tithe, and a few minor additional imposts. Another advantage was the freedom from the feudal services and the seigneurial jurisdiction characteristic of Western feudalism. The Sfahi had no legal right of lordship and justice over the peasants living in his fief. He was not allowed to eject them by force, or theoretically at least, to prevent them from moving and settling elsewhere. He was permitted only to collect the customary dues in return for which he gave military service in time of war. In other words, the Balkan peasant enjoyed the great advantage of being regarded simply as a source of revenue. Undoubtedly, there was considerable difference between the theory and the practice of Turkish feudalism, even when the empire was unimpaired. Nevertheless, the bulk of contemporary evidence indicates clearly that the Balkan peoples at this early period enjoyed substantial advantages denied to their counterparts in the West. Shifting back to the cultural and social sphere, while local institutions were tightly overseen by Constantinople through its appointed officials, the Balkan peoples nevertheless retained a degree of autonomy through the millet system. The millet framework was not organized around culture, language, or ethnicity as modern nationhood suggests. Instead, it was defined exclusively by religious affiliation. To the Ottomans, identity was above all a matter of faith. Subjects were divided into millets, the three largest being Muslim, Orthodox, and Jewish. Each millet was granted the right to manage its own affairs, collecting taxes, maintaining schools and places of worship, and administering justice, according to its respective religious law. Muslims followed Sharia, Christians canon law, and Jews their own traditions. Because of this arrangement, religion overshadowed other forms of identity. People saw themselves primarily as members of a faith community, not as members of a nation in the modern sense. Historian Misha Glenny illustrates this dynamic vividly in her book on the Balkans. Quote, "The word millet means nation. For the Ottomans, nationhood meant religious affiliation, so that Bosnian, Turkish and Albanian Muslims, for example, would all speak different languages and enjoy widely different cultural traditions but would still be part of the same nation. This also held true for the diverse peoples gathered in the Orthodox millet. Marriages between Orthodox Greeks and Orthodox Albanians, Vlachs or Slavs, were not uncommon and created no difficulties for the men and women involved. Marriage to a Catholic Greek, however long his or her Hellenic heritage, was impossible, unless one of the parties converted. As far as the religious hierarchies and the Ottoman state were concerned, religion always took precedence over culture, language, and race in defining one's identity. So, why am I saying all of this? Just to suck off the Ottomans because I am secretly Enver Pasha's strongest soldier? Not really. These are very important things in the development of Balkan nationalism in the early 19th century, and it's all about to make sense in the next chapter. In Western Europe, the phenomenon of nationalism and national awakening was primarily an elite-driven project, emerging first among the intelligentsia and the rising middle class. These groups possessed the literacy, education, and material resources necessary to articulate ideas of the nation in political, cultural, and philosophical terms. Intellectuals, writers, and journalists drew upon Enlightenment ideals as well as romantic notions of folk culture to craft visions of national unity and self-determination. Their writings laid the ideological foundation of nationalism, while the middle class, gaining influence in business and civic life, served as the vehicle that spread these ideas beyond small intellectual circles. Over time, as literacy increased and print culture expanded, nationalist ideas gradually filtered down, or more accurately, trickled down, to artisans, workers, and eventually peasants. With the spread of newspapers and mass education, nationalism ceased to be the preserve of elites and grew into a mass sentiment capable of binding together populations across class lines. A good example of this process can be seen in the Czech national awakening of the 19th century, which unfolded within the Habsburg Empire. Initially, Czech identity was preserved and promoted by a small circle of educated intellectuals, linguists, and historians such as Josef Dobrovský and František Palacký, who sought to revive the Czech language and emphasize a distinctive Czech history. These efforts were supported by urban middle-class figures who founded things like theaters and newspapers that promoted Czech language and literature. Over time, the movement reached artisans in the rural population, who began to embrace Czech as more than a local tongue. By the mid to late 19th century, this awakening had created a powerful sense of Czech national identity that extended well beyond intellectual circles. Basically, what I just talked about, but for the Czechs. The essential point is this: in Western Europe, nationalism was born and advanced by the educated elites, particularly the intelligentsia, supported by the middle class before trickling down to the broader population. Peasants were often the last to be incorporated, as their primary loyalties tended to remain with religion, local traditions, or regional lords. But this process played out very differently in the Balkans. Due to Ottoman social stratification, local populations had been excluded from the ranks of a native upper or middle class. Those spheres were dominated by Turks and Muslim elites. The Balkan peoples themselves were largely confined to agrarian life, working as peasants in the countryside. Without a strong intelligentsia or middle class to take the lead, how could a national awakening emerge? And here lies the crucial distinction. Whereas Western nationalism was spearheaded by educated elites, Balkan nationalism was, from the very beginning, a bottom-up phenomenon. It was not trickle-down, but trickle-up. It began with the peasantry, organized, resilient, and culturally rooted, whose sentiments gradually influenced the later formation of native elites and middle classes. The Ottoman hands-off approach to the countryside, combined with a feudal system that gave peasants relatively more autonomy, fostered a surprisingly strong and organized rural base. This foundation became the vanguard of a national awakening. When the Ottoman Empire entered its period of decline and repression grew harsher, future, it was this peasant class that seized the opportunity. Nearly every Balkan independence movement began as a peasant revolt, swelling over time into broader national revolutions that reshaped the region. But when this national awakening did come, it took on a, let's say, more reactionary approach. Western nationalists of the 18th and 19th century sought to create something new, a modern state, a new civic identity, and a forward-looking national project. By contrast, Balkan nationalists turned not to the future, but to the past, to their glory days before the Ottoman conquest. And how could it be otherwise? What in the Ottoman centuries could they look back on with pride? For nearly 500 years, they had been bound to the countryside by class stratification, with religion overshadowing cultural or national identities. In effect, there had been no gradual evolution from point A to point D, with transitional stages in between. Instead, Balkan peoples were frozen at point A for centuries, as though encased in ice. When that ice finally thawed in the 19th century, they were forced to leap straight to point D, skipping all the intervening steps. The result was a hybrid, simultaneously medieval and modern, rooted in memory yet propelled into the present. That hybrid is what defined Balkan nationalism. Stavrianos captures this dynamic well. Quote, "First, it should be noted that the past, even the very distant past, and the present are side by side in the Balkans. Centuries chronologically remote from each other are really contemporary. Governments and peoples, particularly intellectuals, have based their attitudes and actions on what happened or what they believe to have happened centuries ago. The reason is that during the almost 5 centuries of Turkish rule, the Balkan peoples had no history. Time stood still for them. Consequently, when they won their independence in the 19th century, their point of reference was to the pre-Turkish period, to the medieval ages or beyond. Thus, the Romanians have looked back with pride to their Latin origin in Roman times, the Greeks to the classical period and to the Great Byzantine Empire, the Serbians and the Bulgarians to their respective medieval empires controlling a large part of the peninsula, and the Albanians to their Illyrian background and to their 15th century hero George Skanderbeg. And this backward glance carried serious consequences. Look at the maps of those glory days the Balkan nations sought to resurrect. The problem is obvious. Their borders overlapped. Nearly every people in the Balkans envisioned a national revival that claimed territories also claimed by their neighbors. Thus, the project of national awakening immediately set the stage for bitter rivalries. Each nation's dream of revival was another's irredentist nightmare. It is here that the roots of the infamous Balkan animosities began to take shape. This is also where one of the favorite pastimes of Balkan nationalists emerged, appropriating the history of their neighbors to boost international prestige and prove to Western powers how mighty and relevant they were. This tendency was only intensified by the peasant origins of their national awakenings. Romantic folktales of past glory, spread for centuries through oral tradition, often carried exaggerations or outright fabrications. Instead of remaining harmless folklore, these tales were elevated to the level of serious national history, with consequences that can be felt to this day. And that is how you get stuff like this.
Isto to se desilo u Iranu, naši koji su vršili istraživanja nafte u predelima i onda su im na jednom mjestu seljaci rekli da su oni Srbi poreklom, ali da nije to dobro za njih, da to oni afirmišu. Tada je islamski Iran bio jak, znate? Ali da oni znaju da su Srbi i čak su se mogli sporazumeti s njima.
Stavrianos also observed something similar in regards to the legacy of Alexander the Great and how different nationalists reinterpreted it. Quote, "This obsession with the past has its ludicrous aspects. Alexander the Great is claimed by the Greeks as a Macedonian Greek. He is also claimed by the Albanians, who issued coins bearing his image, and he is claimed by the Bulgarians, who exhorted their armies in World War I to, quote, to revive the fame of the great Bulgarian Alexander the Great. More serious have been the political repercussions of this living in the past. Peaceful inter-Balkan relations were scarcely likely in the face of simultaneous attempts to revive the medieval Greek, Bulgarian, and Serbian empires. Thus, historical tradition has been an important factor, and usually a disturbing factor, in Balkan affairs in the modern period. The way Balkan nationalists justified their territorial claims was often wildly inconsistent. In one case, they would argue a region was rightfully theirs because it was inhabited by their ethnic group, or by people they insisted belonged to their ethnicity. In another, they would claim land simply because their ancestors had controlled it centuries earlier, even though none of their own people lived there. The logic mattered little. The goal was always the same: to raise national legitimacy at home and abroad, which was also strengthened by peasant superstitions and tales. Underlying all of this was a deep sense of inferiority. Compared to Western Europe, the Balkans were viewed as a backward, primitive corner of the continent, lagging in economics, governance, science, and social development. To compensate, Balkan nations tried to inflate their prestige by claiming as much history and territory as possible, even if that meant appropriating the legacies of others. This is why Albanians, Bulgarians, and Greeks all tried to tie themselves to Alexander the Great, despite the fact that ancient identities had no resemblance to modern nations. The association itself carried immense symbolic weight on the world stage. It is also why Serbs today fiercely emphasize Nikola Tesla's Serbian heritage, while Croats lay their own claim by featuring him on their euro coins, with their reasoning being that he grew up and lived in Croatia. Balkan nationalism from its birth was driven less by a vision of the future than by a desperate attempt to reclaim lost glory. It was nationalism born out of trauma, the trauma of conquest, humiliation, and centuries of stagnation. At its heart was the belief that something vital had been stolen, and it was the sacred duty of each nation not only to avenge this loss but to surpass it. But that trauma is the last piece of the Balkan nationalist puzzle we are looking for, and it also explains why the numerous Balkan peoples hate each other so much. Hatred that has led to the barbarism and ethnic cleansing the Balkans are known for. Traumatic nationalism, a term coined by American historian Sabrina P. Ramet, a specialist in Eastern Europe and the Balkans, captures the essence of Balkan nationalism with remarkable precision. As she describes it, quote, "When a nation recalls its past as filled with suffering, catastrophes, and calamities, and views the world as menacing, the result is traumatic nationalism. In the turbulent years following the independence wars, Balkan nationalism acquired a specifically traumatic reflection, drawing its energy, out of habit and by nature, from the reinterpretation of their histories in terms of suffering, exploitation, pain, and injustice." Or, I guess if we want to use more modern terms, we can call it traumatic revanchism, a type of revanchism where the nation and people focus on a specific injustice and suffering that has happened to them by the hands of another nation and another people, and the main aim is to get revenge and right that wrong. This, I believe, sums up Balkan nationalism perfectly. Of course, this sentiment is not unique to the Balkans. History is filled with numerous examples. Carthage's fury in the Second Punic War was driven by the desire to avenge its humiliation the first. France, after the Franco-Prussian War, clung to the lost provinces of Alsace-Lorraine with the same intensity. Most famously, post-World War I Germany, humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles, became fertile ground for National Socialism, which rode to power on the promise of revenge and reversal. Revanchism, in short, is a recurring feature of history. What makes the Balkans different, however, is that their nations were not merely passing through such a phase, they were born into it. Unlike Carthage, France, or Germany, whose traumatic revanchism followed specific defeats, Balkan nationalism itself emerged out of centuries of trauma. It was not just a political program or a cultural revival, it was the lived memory of suffering, humiliation, and dispossession, crystallized into national identity. identity. This gave Balkan nationalism a uniquely visceral quality. The trauma was not a chapter to be overcome, but a permanent scar, transmitted through folk songs, oral tales, and sermons. Glory and honor were not abstract values, but tangible possessions, stolen possessions, that had to be reclaimed to restore dignity. Nationalist projects in the Balkans therefore often assumed an uncompromising all-or-nothing character. Compromise meant weakness, reconciliation betrayal. For peoples who defined themselves by laws, only total reversal, revenge, restoration, expansion could suffice. Anything less would mean the wound remaining open, festering across generations. On a psychological level, this gave Balkan nationalism its uniquely volatile energy. These nations were haunted by ghosts they could not escape. Every insult, every border dispute was magnified 100-fold. To any casual observer, it would just seem like it was about land or prestige. Not for the Balkans. It's not just about that, but about reopening an ancient scar, about confirming a narrative that cast them as eternal victims robbed of their rightful inheritance. In this kind of environment, myth and memory fused into one, turning the past into a permanent battlefield. Unlike Western nationalism, which sought to look forward, Balkan nationalism looked sideways and backward, trapped in a cycle of loss and revenge. The reason it was able to spiral to this level lies, again, in the fact that it was spearheaded not by educated elites, but by peasants, an illiterate class more prone to violence and raw emotion. There was no intelligentsia, a proper educated class to hold this kind of sentiment back and give it a more rational side. It was running on pure emotions and vengeance, and any upper class that did come into existence later bowed down to it rather than seeking to tame the beast. What made the hatred between Balkan peoples so visceral was not only competing claims to land or history, but the way identity itself came to be defined in opposition to the neighbor. To be Greek meant not being Bulgarian, to be Serbian meant not being Albanian. National identities sharpened themselves by demonizing those around them. Centuries of trauma conditioned entire communities to see survival as a zero-sum game, where one people's rise could only be achieved through another's downfall. In this context, grudges and perceived injuries were not fleeting, they became heirlooms, passed down to the next generation. Neighbors were not seen as fellow sufferers, but as rivals who embodied the very injustices of the past, since they held or wanted to hold something that they saw as rightfully theirs. And that is perhaps the deepest tragedy of all. This mutual hatred was not inevitable. Under the Ottomans, when religion held primacy over nationality, Balkan peoples often coexisted with relative peace, united by faith rather than divided by ethnicity. Serbs and Bulgarians, for example, recognized one another first and foremost as Orthodox Christians, not as national rivals. Ironically, it was the very Ottoman system that fostered this coexistence, but it was also the same system by stifling the development of native elites and freezing cultural growth that ensured this fragile peace would eventually collapse. To finally answer the central question, Balkan nationalism is the way it is because it was born in an environment where history stood still and memory was frozen in trauma. Unlike the West, where nationalism emerged within intellectual circles and gradually matured into civic or cultural projects, the Balkans inherited a nationalism that was already sharpened like a blade, reviving lost empires, clinging to myths, and demanding vengeance for centuries of perceived humiliation. It did not evolve as a political philosophy aimed at future progress, but as a psychological necessity to reclaim what was seen as stolen. With no native middle class or intelligentsia to channel these energies, nationalism was never tempered. It emerged raw, reactive, and rooted in grievance. What this history teaches us reaches beyond the Balkans. When nationalism grows without guidance, when it is driven from below by populations shaped by suffering, dispossession, and rage, the call for freedom can easily turn into a call for vengeance. Without a class of thinkers, educators, and leaders to reframe these passions into constructive ends, the desire for liberation mutates into a cycle of perpetual rivalry, where victory for one side always demands humiliation for another. The Balkan story reveals what happens when collective trauma is given free rein. Nationalism becomes a mirror of pain rather than a vision of possibility. And this is the deeper warning, coming from a former Balkan nationalist myself, or at least a nationalist in the Balkan sense. Nationalism led by resentment alone cannot build. It can only destroy and then rebuild in its own wounded image. That is not to say resentment is useless. It is a powerful motivator, a vehicle for action, but it is also a force that, if left unchecked, consumes everything in its path. This is the double-edged sword of populist sentiment, something that will not only destroy its enemies, but also its very own allies. Let me also clarify, the peasants of the Balkans, deprived of alternatives, naturally forged their identity from the tools they had right now: folk tales, grievances, and memories of injustice. In many ways, it was inevitable, and yes, another legacy one might lay at the feet of Ottoman rule. But when such materials form the sole foundation of a nation, politics is reduced to the logic of revenge, and history becomes a weapon rather than a teacher. If the Balkans remind us of anything, it is that the health of a society depends on its ability to balance the passions of the masses with the restraint and foresight of educated voices. Without that balance, nationalism ceases to be a path toward freedom and instead chains nations to their own unresolved wounds. If you wish to learn more about the Balkans and want to explore nationalist sentiments further and some more specific examples, since I only gave a general overview, I highly recommend the book The Balkans Since 1453 by Stavrianos and The Balkans, Nationalism, War and Great Powers by Misha Glenny. These two are must-reads about this corner of Europe. One more honorable mention I also found informative, though haven't found anything that important to include here, is the book A Modern History of the Balkans by Thanos Veremis. Yeah, I couldn't believe that the purple-skinned man himself was a Balkan historian. Anyway, that would be all for today, and I will see you all in the next video. Thanks to all the glorious people on Patreon who are supporting me in these endeavors. Special thanks to Mudkips Our Life and SOAV for their extremely generous and high pledges. That really helps me out a lot. Anyway, bye bye!